In November 1923, a single United States dollar could purchase 4.2 trillion German marks. Just 9 years earlier, that same dollar was worth a mere 4.2 marks. This mathematically absurd depreciation represents one of the most severe financial collapses in modern history, a period where banknotes became cheaper than the paper they were printed on. The Weimar Republic did not arrive at this precipice by accident. The devastation was engineered through a cascading series of geopolitical mandates, desperate fiscal policies, and a fundamental misunderstanding of monetary mechanics. Investigating the systemic causes of this collapse reveals a terrifying blueprint of how quickly an advanced, industrialized economy can disintegrate when the foundational trust in its medium of exchange is shattered. The architecture of this disaster was drafted long before the crisis reached its zenith. At the outbreak of World War I, the German Empire made a fateful structural decision, suspending the gold standard to fund military operations through aggressive borrowing rather than taxation. The imperial government gambled that a swift victory would allow them to extract massive indemnities from defeated nations, thereby balancing the national ledger. Instead, the conflict ground into a grueling war of attrition, leaving the newly formed democratic government with a staggering, unfunded domestic debt. The structural integrity of the national balance sheet had been quietly hollowed out, replaced by a mountain of paper obligations and immense war bonds that the state had no mathematical pathway to repay. Defeat brought an even harsher financial reality. The Treaty of Versailles imposed punitive reparations on the fractured nation, demanding 132 billion gold marks to compensate the Allied powers for the immense destruction of the war. Because these obligations had to be paid in hard currency, physical gold, or tangible resources rather than the rapidly depreciating domestic paper, the government was forced into an impossible corner. They lacked the gold reserves and the export revenue to meet the crushing schedule of international payments. The geopolitical architecture of the peace settlement acted as an economic vice, systematically stripping the sovereign state of its wealth-generating assets while exponentially increasing its external liabilities. To bridge the chasm between its obligations and its revenues, the central bank initiated a fatal mechanism. The Reichsbank began discounting government debt at an unprecedented scale, printing unbacked paper currency to buy foreign exchange, which was then immediately handed over to the Allies. This aggressive expansion of the monetary base diluted the purchasing power of every existing note in circulation. As the supply of money surged without a corresponding increase in economic output or industrial productivity, the fundamental laws of supply and demand violently reasserted themselves. The price of imported goods skyrocketed, forcing domestic manufacturers to raise prices, which in turn required the government to print even more money to sustain basic operations. The international markets quickly recognized the underlying rot within the German financial architecture. Foreign investors and domestic capital alike fled the deteriorating currency, seeking refuge in stable assets abroad or hoarding foreign exchange. This capital flight accelerated the depreciation, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of economic decline. When foreign exchange markets priced in the relentless printing, the exchange rate plummeted, making the acquisition of the foreign currency required for reparations exponentially more expensive. The feedback loop was definitively closed, and the monetary system began to consume itself from the inside out, driven by the relentless mathematics of compound devaluation. The breaking point arrived in early 1923, triggered by a ruthless assertion of international leverage, claiming that Germany had defaulted on a minor, scheduled delivery of timber and coal. French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heartland of the nation. This military maneuver seized control of the factories, coal mines, and railways that represented the absolute core of German economic productivity. The occupying forces intended to extract their reparations directly from the source, bypassing the sovereign financial system entirely and effectively, severing the Weimar Republic from its primary engine of economic growth. The government in Berlin responded with a strategy that would ultimately seal the fate of their currency. They ordered the workers in the Ruhr to engage in passive resistance, effectively launching a massive general strike against the occupying foreign forces. To support the striking workers and the paralyzed industrial sector, the state committed to paying their wages despite the complete halt in production. With tax revenues from the region entirely severed, the treasury turned exclusively to the printing presses. The state was now financing a massive, unproductive population with newly created fiat, injecting endless liquidity into an economy entirely starved of actual goods and services. The resulting economic environment birthed a devastating wage price spiral that defied all historical precedent. As the sheer volume of paper flooded the market, the velocity of money reached a terminal pace. Citizens realized that the cash in their pockets was losing value by the hour, prompting them to spend their wages the exact moment they received them. Workers were paid twice a day, rushing to bakeries with wheelbarrows full of cash before the exchange rates were updated at noon. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January 1923 surged to an incomprehensible 200,000 million marks by November. The fundamental utility of money as a reliable store of value evaporated, leaving only a frantic, frictionless medium of immediate exchange. The physical manifestation of this uncontrolled currency devaluation became a surreal spectacle. Banknotes were used as wallpaper, burned as kindling in household stoves, and given to children as playthings. The cost of the ink and paper frequently exceeded the nominal value printed on the face of the bills. This was not merely an economic anomaly, but a profound psychological collapse. The social contract binding the citizen to the state through the mechanism of stable money was unilaterally voided. People reverted to primitive barter systems, trading heirloom jewelry and family silver for basic agricultural staples, entirely bypassing the sovereign currency that had become an object of national mockery. Beneath the visible chaos, hyperinflation acted as a ruthless engine of wealth redistribution. The phenomenon systematically annihilated the savings of the middle class, vaporizing pensions, government bonds, and lifetime bank deposits overnight. Conversely, those holding massive debts found their liabilities effectively erased by the devaluation. A mortgage taken out to purchase a factory 5 years prior could now be paid off with the equivalent cost of a single cup of coffee. The inflationary environment heavily subsidized aggressive borrowers at the direct expense of conservative savers, completely inverting the traditional incentive structures that underpin a functioning capitalist economy. Astute industrialists capitalized on this chaotic environment with clinical, predatory precision. Figures like Hugo Stinnes recognized that hard assets, commercial real estate, coal mines, and shipping fleets retained their intrinsic value regardless of the sovereign currency's collapse. By borrowing heavily and depreciating paper to acquire tangible infrastructure, they amassed vast, untouchable empires. They repaid their immense loans weeks later with newly printed, entirely worthless notes. This aggressive leveraging of structural failure concentrated immense corporate power into the hands of a select few, while the broader populace was systematically impoverished by the invisible tax of inflation. The echoes of this massive wealth transfer resonated deeply through the social strata of the nation. The eradication of middle-class financial stability created a profound sense of disenfranchisement, humiliation, and betrayal. The very demographic that typically anchors a democratic society, the professionals, civil servants, and small business owners found themselves destitute through absolutely no fault of their own. This sudden proletarianization bred deep, enduring resentment against the financial establishment, the banking sector, and the political institutions that had overseen the catastrophe. The economic vacuum rapidly filled with political extremism, laying the psychological groundwork for the authoritarian movements that would soon consume the continent. By late autumn, the financial system was entirely paralyzed, forcing the government to engineer a radical monetary intervention. In November 1923, the government introduced a parallel currency called the Rentenmark. Because the state possessed no gold reserves to back this new issuance, financial architect Hjalmar Schacht engineered a brilliant psychological pivot. The Rentenmark was theoretically backed by the newly formed Rentenbank, which held nominal mortgages on all agricultural land and commercial real estate in the country. The new currency was pegged to the old mark at a staggering ratio of 1 to 1 trillion, effectively erasing 12 zeros from the national ledger in a single stroke. The mechanics of this stabilization relied entirely on artificial scarcity and ruthlessly enforced discipline. The government strictly capped the total issuance of the new currency at 3.2 billion units and explicitly forbade the central bank from discounting government treasury bills to fund state deficits. The printing presses that had flooded the nation with infinite paper were abruptly and visibly halted. The state was forced to balance its budget through aggressive spending cuts, increased taxation, and massive layoffs in the civil service, a brutal but mathematically necessary austerity required to defend the new currency peg. The immediate acceptance of this unbacked fiat instrument is often termed the miracle of the Rentenmark. In reality, it was not magic, but a masterclass in restoring market psychology and manipulating public perception. The populace, exhausted by the daily trauma of hyperinflation, desperately wanted to believe in a stable medium of exchange. Because the issuance was strictly limited and the government demonstrated the political will to halt deficit monetization, trust returned almost instantaneously. The velocity of money slowed to normal levels, consumer prices stabilized, and the frantic, panic-driven hoarding of goods ceased entirely. This domestic stabilization paved the way for a crucial international realignment regarding the nation's external liabilities. In 1924, the Dawes Plan was negotiated, fundamentally restructuring the crushing burden of the Treaty of Versailles. The agreement provided a staggered payment schedule aligned with actual German economic performance and facilitated a massive influx of foreign capital, primarily from American investment banks. This external liquidity injection provided the vital foreign reserves needed to transition the temporary Rentenmark into a new, gold-backed Reichsmark. The immediate crisis was quelled, but it required subjugating the domestic economy entirely to the volatile flows of international credit. The scars of 1923 fundamentally altered the trajectory of European monetary philosophy for generations. The devastating consequences of prioritizing short-term political expediency over long-term currency stability became a foundational trauma etched into the national consciousness. It entrenched an institutional paranoia regarding inflation that would dictate central banking policies in the region for the next century. The realization that a sovereign state could legally confiscate the entire wealth of its citizens simply by operating a printing press shattered the illusion of fiat neutrality forever. Dissecting the Weimar experience reveals the fragile architecture upon which all modern financial systems rest. Currency is ultimately a social construct, a collective hallucination sustained only by unyielding confidence in the issuing authority and the disciplined management of systemic supply. When that institutional discipline evaporates, the complex web of global trade, corporate investment, and domestic social order disintegrates with terrifying speed. The hyperinflation of the 1920s stands as a permanent, systemic warning to modern economies. The most destructive force in any financial system is not the loss of capital, but the irreversible loss of trust.